Well, one advantage that virtue ethics has is that I think it does start from a very natural way in which we think about our lives. What I call the entry point for ethical reflection, thinking about your life as a whole. And the advantage of that is, I think, people do think about their lives as a whole and whether their lives are going well or badly. And there are numerous topics that fall naturally into thinking about that. Thinking about the emotions, thinking about your commitments to other people, thinking about your friends, thinking about your social responsibilities.
Looking at ethics in terms of who you are and how your life is going is not new.
Socrates loved to cite one of the inscriptions over at the shrine at Delphi, "Know thyself." In a certain sense, all the Greeks, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, moving backwards, found this to be true, that the value in human life was ultimately to be gained by knowing our own natures and knowing what it would take to perfect those natures, to take our natural possibilities and to actualize them.
At the core of ancient Greek ethics was the quest for eudaimonia, which is often translated happiness, but in a distinctive sense.
I prefer the term human flourishing, which reminds us that we're talking about a complex form of human activity, which has a number of different parts that are not reducible to the others, and that doesn't just consist in a feeling of satisfaction. So it means a total form of activity that includes all the major human functions, that is, in that sense, a complete life for a human being.
The Greek word arete may be translated as either virtue or excellence.
They did not distinguish between morality, quotes morality, and other aspects of personal life. It was a much more integrated picture. They thought much more in terms of what made for a worthwhile life for the individual, in which these various aspects could be brought together.
So with virtue ethics, we can talk about the role of entertaining friends, giving dinner parties, all these things that Aristotle actually discusses in the Ethics, and then, put that alongside the more obvious and commonly recognized virtues like courage and justice. And I think that helps a lot. I mean, we have to see the life as a whole before we can see what the part of each virtue is in it.
Often in ancient philosophy, virtues are compared to skills. In the words of Aristotle,
as is the case with any skill, we acquire the virtues by first doing virtuous acts. We acquire a skill by practicing the activities involved in the skill. For example, we become builders by building, and we learn to play the harp by playing the harp. In the same way, we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, and courageous by doing acts of courage.
He thinks you acquire a virtue typically by being shown other people who have that virtue, and you do what they do, and gradually you see the point of doing what they do, and you learn how to do it the way they do it. And there's obvious analogies with skills, like learning to play an instrument.
Any definition of virtues implies a standard for how people ought to be. For Plato and Aristotle, reason ought to guide emotion and appetite. Each of these basic parts of human nature has its own special virtue.
The special virtue of the rational part of the soul is wisdom. The special virtue of the spirited part of the soul is courage. And the special virtue of the appetitive part of the soul is self-control or temperance, control over one's own appetites. All of these virtues come into being, so to speak, at the same time or under the same condition, and that is where where justice is obtained, where there's a balance of the soul.
As a guideline for living in accord with reason, Aristotle recommends seeking the mean or middle course between extremes.
Acting well in any field is achieved by looking to the mean and bringing one's actions into line with this standard of moderation. Virtue, therefore, must also aim at the mean. For human virtue deals with our feelings and actions. And in these, we can go to excess or fall short, or we can hit the mean.
We tend to think of values as toggle switches. There's right and wrong. There's on and off. There's this, there's good, and its opposite. For Aristotle, virtue was finding the middle ground between two opposites.
Generosity is not opposed to meanness. Generosity actually is in the middle of, on the one hand, stinginess and meanness, and on the other hand, being profligate with money.
Aristotle analyzes courage as the mean between the excess of what we might call bravado, the person who runs into a hail of bullets. I mean, that's not brave, that's just foolish. And cowardice on the other hand.
To seek the mean might seem a simple guideline, but it requires balancing many factors.
It is possible to feel fear, confidence, desire, anger, pity, pleasure, and so on, either too much or too little, both of which extremes are bad. But to feel these at the right times and on the right occasions, and toward the right persons, and with the right object, and in the right fashion, is the mean between the extremes, and is the best state, and is the mark of virtue.
The right answer is the answer which is appropriate proston kairon, which perhaps is best translated into English as the occasion demands. And the occasion is itself something that's continually changing.
It's a bit like the pianist who plays the notes in the right way, at the right time, at the right speed, with the right, all the details of piano performance. It takes a long time to train yourself to get like that, and a lot of experience.
The contrast between virtue ethics and other approaches stands out clearly in how to make sound judgments in complex situations.
I think that utilitarianism and Kantianism, what they're trying to do, I personally think they can't do it, but what they're trying to do is to produce a kind of decision procedure at the limit. That's a bit simplified, but roughly a way of working out what to do. Now, virtue ethics shouldn't even pretend to be telling you how to work out what to do.
Now, the story that virtue ethics has to tell about right action doesn't give you a formula. It doesn't tell you how to find out what the right action is if you otherwise would have no clue about it. So it's not something such that you could read a few pages and then suddenly be able to know what the right action is.
The whole point of virtue ethics is to say the ethical condition is not the condition of having a certain right theory. What virtue ethics tells us is that the desirable ethical condition is having a certain character.
What traits of character, then, can help you judge the best course in a complex situation? Aristotle proposes a virtue which he calls phronesis, practical intelligence or wisdom.
The best way to see what practical wisdom is to start with skills again, I think. That first of all you learn what it is that you have to do. To play the piano, you've got to move your fingers in certain ways. And to do that, you have to learn scales and various things like that. You learn the right things to do. And then gradually you learn why those are the things you have to do. You learn not just that you play this scale and that scale and the other scale. You learn how all the various bits of technique that you learn fit together as the technique of the pianist. So there's two things. That first of all, your understanding of what you're doing becomes more global. You understand what you're doing now and then what you're doing next and so on. And gradually you come to see the point of doing what you're doing as a whole. And the other way in which practical wisdom develops is you get a deeper and deeper understanding of the point of acting as you're acting. So you don't just act in a certain way because your dad told you or because you were told to do that at school. You come to see why you should do that.
One of the interesting differences between Aristotle, say, and his whole approach to ethics, and someone like Kant, is that for Aristotle, the ultimate ethical good, the best place to be, is a place where you act in a way that is that feels right to you, that feels good to you, that actually gives you pleasure in doing the right thing. The payoff, as it were, in all these ethics, Greek ethics, such as Aristotle's, they say is in happiness. We will live a happy life if we live a virtuous life.